On the afternoon of March 21, 1976, a single gunshot shattered the silence inside a luxury chalet in Aspen, Colorado. Moments later, one of the most famous skiers in the world, Vladimir "Spider Sabich, lay bleeding across the floor with a bullet buried deep inside his body. Standing only a few feet away was the woman he loved, French actress and singer Claudine Longet. Her hands had been holding the pistol only seconds earlier. When police arrived, she insisted it had been an accident. She claimed the gun had fired while Spider was showing her how to use it, but almost immediately, detectives began noticing details that refused to fit together. Yet even that was not the part that left people speechless. There was something more that shocked everyone. Welcome to the cursed Hollywood. Long before her name became linked to a fatal shooting, Claudine Longet was the kind of woman who seemed destined for a fairy tale. She was born on January 29, 1942, in Paris, where elegance came naturally and beauty could open doors that talent alone never could. As a teenager, she trained as a dancer and eventually found work at the famous Folies Bergère, a cabaret known for launching young performers into glamorous careers. It was there that she learned how to command a room without saying much at all. She had a quiet smile, delicate features, and a soft French accent that people found impossible to ignore. In the early 1960s, she left France for the United States, chasing opportunities that barely seemed real. Fate stepped in almost immediately. While working as a dancer in Las Vegas, she met the enormously popular singer Andy Williams. Their meeting lasted only a few moments, but it changed the direction of her entire life. Williams was already one of the biggest television stars in America, admired by millions and surrounded by fame. Claudine was young, unknown, and had only just arrived in the country. Before long, the two were inseparable. They married in 1961, and almost overnight, Claudine was introduced to a world most people only saw on television screens. She appeared regularly on The Andy Williams Show, released several albums, acted in films and television, and became a familiar face in magazines that celebrated Hollywood's most glamorous couples. Her gentle singing voice and unmistakable French charm turned her into a celebrity in her own right. To the public, their marriage looked effortless. They had children, lived among the biggest stars in entertainment, and seemed to embody the polished image of American success. But behind that carefully protected image, the marriage was slowly beginning to crack. Andy's demanding career kept him constantly on the road, while Claudine struggled to find an identity beyond being the wife of one of America's most famous entertainers. By the end of the 1960s, the perfect Hollywood marriage no longer felt perfect at all. The relationship that had once transformed an unknown French dancer into an international celebrity was quietly falling apart. When the marriage finally ended, Claudine stepped into a very different chapter of her life, one that would bring her face to face with a charismatic Olympic skiing champion named Vladimir "Spider Sabich, a man whose life would eventually end with a single gunshot inside a mountain home in Aspen. By the mid-1970s, Vladimir "Spider Sabich was one of the biggest names in American skiing. Tall, athletic, effortlessly charming, he had become more than an Olympic racer. Even though his competitive career had slowed, his popularity had not. He lived in a beautiful chalet overlooking the Colorado mountains, surrounded by expensive cars, glamorous parties, and friends who included actors, musicians, and wealthy businessmen. People joked that Spider didn't just live in Aspen. He owned the spirit of it. When Claudine entered his life after her divorce from Andy Williams, the relationship fascinated the press. She was Hollywood elegance. He was America's golden sports hero. Together, they looked like another perfect celebrity couple. They skied together, traveled together, entertained guests at Spider's mountain home, and quickly became fixtures in Aspen's glamorous social scene. But those closest to them noticed that the relationship wasn't nearly as effortless as it appeared. Spider enjoyed his freedom, Friends described him as outgoing, flirtatious, and reluctant to settle into a traditional relationship. Claudine, meanwhile, had already watched one marriage collapse under the glare of fame. She wanted stability. The differences between them slowly became impossible to ignore. People close to the couple later spoke of arguments that became more frequent as time passed. There were disagreements about commitment, jealousy, and where the relationship was heading. Spider reportedly wasn't ready for marriage, while Claudine wanted reassurance that their future was moving in the same direction. Those tensions remained hidden behind the smiles that cameras continued to capture. Then came March 21, 1976. It was an ordinary Sunday in Aspen. Inside Spider's chalet, the couple spent part of the afternoon together. At some point, Claudine picked up a .22 caliber pistol. Minutes later, a single shot tore through the quiet mountain home. The bullet struck Spider at close range. The shot echoed through the chalet just after 5 p.m. Spider Sabich staggered backward, clutching his abdomen as blood spread across his clothes. The .22 caliber bullet had entered his body at close range, tearing through vital organs. He collapsed onto the floor while Claudine stood only a few feet away, the pistol still in the room. She immediately called for help. When paramedics arrived, they found Spider barely alive. He was rushed to the hospital, but the damage was catastrophic. Surgeons fought to save him, yet there was nothing they could do. Within hours, one of America's most recognizable skiing champions was dead. From the beginning, Claudine insisted it had been a terrible accident. According to her account, Spider had been showing her how to handle the pistol when it suddenly discharged. She claimed she had been unfamiliar with firearms and that the gun went off unintentionally while he was explaining its operation. Investigators, however, weren't convinced that the case was so simple. Detectives examined the chalet inch by inch, studying the position of the weapon, the bullet's path, and the physical evidence left behind. Some aspects of Claudine's explanation appeared difficult to reconcile with the forensic findings. Questions were raised about exactly where each of them had been standing and how the gun could have fired in the way she described. Those questions quickly became the center of the investigation. The case grew even more complicated because of mistakes made in the first hours after the shooting. Investigators later acknowledged that evidence had not been handled as carefully as it should have been. Those early errors would haunt the prosecution for the rest of the case, giving Claudine's defense room to challenge critical pieces of evidence before a jury ever heard them. Outside the courthouse, the public had already chosen sides. Some believed they were looking at a tragic accident that had destroyed 2 lives in a single instant. When prosecutors finally brought the case to court, many people expected Claudine Longet to face a murder conviction. That never happened. One of the biggest blows came from the investigation itself. Detectives had made serious procedural mistakes after the shooting. During the search of the chalet, investigators obtained pieces of evidence in ways the court later ruled were improper. As a result, important forensic evidence and some of Claudine's statements were either excluded or severely limited at trial. What had begun as a high-profile homicide case suddenly became far more difficult to prosecute. The charge was eventually reduced to criminally negligent homicide, a far less serious offense than murder. The courtroom became one of the biggest stories in America. Every day, reporters crowded outside, waiting for another development. To some, Claudine appeared as a grieving woman whose life had been shattered by a tragic accident. After days of testimony, the jury returned its verdict. Claudine Longet was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide, not murder. The sentence stunned the public. She received 30 days in jail. Under a work release arrangement, she was allowed to leave custody during the day and return at night. She was also fined a relatively modest amount. To many Americans, The punishment seemed astonishingly light for a case that had ended with a man dead from a gunshot. The outrage didn't stop there. Spider Sabich's family later filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Claudine. Rather than continue another long legal battle, the case ended with an out-of-court settlement. Legally, the case was over. Then, just when the headlines finally began to fade, Claudine made a decision that shocked even people who had followed the trial from the first day. The man she chose to spend the rest of her life with had been standing much closer to the case than anyone expected. His name was Ron Austin, and he was no ordinary admirer. He had been one of the attorneys on the legal team that defended Claudine after Spider Sabich's death. During the months when prosecutors were trying to build their case, he had been working to protect hers. When news broke that the two had become a couple, the reaction was immediate. To many people, it felt almost impossible to believe. The woman at the center of one of America's most controversial homicide cases had begun a relationship with a lawyer from her own defense team. Although there was no finding that their relationship had begun improperly during the trial, the timing alone fueled public suspicion and endless speculation. Critics questioned the appearance of it. The controversy never fully disappeared. Years later, Claudine and Ron Austin married and quietly settled in Aspen, far from the television studios and Hollywood parties that had once defined her life. They stayed together for decades, avoiding interviews and rarely speaking publicly about the case that had changed both of their lives. For Spider Sabich's friends, however, the marriage was difficult to separate from the memory of what had happened. The image that stayed with them was not of a wedding. It was of a man lying on the floor of his own home after a single gunshot. A life ending while questions that many believed would never be answered lingered in the air. By then, Claudine had found peace away from the spotlight. Spider never had the chance. And as the years passed, the man whose life had been cut short at just 31 slowly became a footnote in the very story that had taken everything from him. The next chapter belongs to Spider himself, the athlete, the friend, and the man whose death is still remembered far more vividly than the remarkable life he lived. Claudine Longet almost disappeared. The woman who had once appeared on television before millions chose a life where cameras were no longer welcome. She stopped chasing acting roles, rarely gave interviews, and avoided the celebrity world that had once celebrated her. Aspen became her refuge, a place where she could live quietly with Ron Austin, far from the constant attention that had followed her through the late 1970s. Unlike many famous figures at the center of scandals, Claudine never wrote a memoir explaining her side of the story. She never launched a public campaign to rebuild her image. She spoke only occasionally, leaving the events of March 21, 1976, largely untouched. That silence allowed the case to take on a life of its own. Today, Claudine Longet is remembered far less for her music, her films, or the glamorous career that first made her famous. Those achievements have been almost completely eclipsed by a single afternoon inside a mountain chalet.